I am Executive Director of the Australian Technology Network of Universities, representing my 4 universities, and as well as in my submission, the University of Newcastle and Deakin University as our observer members as well.
Excellent, thank you. You have provided an opening statement, which I believe has been circulated to members of the committee. Rather than have you read out the statement, I prefer to go straight to question, if that's okay with you.
That's fine, Chair. Yep, Senator.
Excellent, thank you. So I will hand over to Senator Pratt.
I'll go off if you could, Mr Chairman.
Sure, Senator Carr.
Thank you. Mr Sheehy, it's been widely reported that the universities are supporting this package. I understand that the ATN has a number of amendments it's looking for in this package. In fact, 6 amendments. Could you outline what those 6 amendments are?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we would like to see a number of key amendments to this legislation in order to improve particularly its equity and participation measures, which we've described as improving the objects of the bill. Our first recommendation, and these are in order of our priorities, an extension of demand-driven access or a guaranteed undergraduate place for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not just those from regional and remote areas. Secondly, maintaining the current regional and enabling loadings in the Commonwealth grant scheme, so effectively opposing the changes proposed in the bill and maintaining the current arrangements for enabling courses. Thirdly, a commitment to a review of funding rates, both in terms of student contributions and the direct subsidies that universities receive, particularly in the STEM fields, within 12 months of assent, either committed to in the bill or a revised explanatory memorandum. Fourthly, we'd like to see a removal of the 50% completion rate rule from the bill entirely. Fifthly, we'd like an enshrining in the legislation of the National Priorities and Industry Linkages Fund, or NPILF, rather than left to regulation, and ensure indexation for the Commonwealth Grant Scheme funding is legislated, again, rather than left to regulation.
See, these are not small matters. These go right to the heart of the bill. And I'm just wondering how it can be said that you support the bill. I understand that you won't support the bill. Is that the case, unless these amendments are actually carried?
Yes, we've said should these sensible amendments be made, Senator, we would.
So let me be clear about that. You're saying that while you support the policy objectives of the intentions of the government, you do not support the passage of the bill unless these amendments are made.
That's correct, Senator.
I see. Thank you very much. And I'm wondering if you've mentioned the last one in particular, the question of regulations, the Commonwealth Grant Scheme regulation funding is legislated. So you want to see significant changes there. Now, that's a really fundamental change, given that the promises that have been made by the government to various university groups and to individual vice-chancellors are predicated on ministerial discretion. You're aware that Mark Warburton has said that none of the promises that have been made, or the key promises, particularly in the bill, are not actually in this bill.
I am aware of Mark Warburton's submission and those comments. And of
do you agree with them?
Well, it reflects our 6 recommendations for amendment, Senator, so yes, I do agree with them. And I'd also refer to the Universities Australia submission, where they talk about all of the reductions in the bill are legislated and all of the increases or guarantees of funding somewhat absent. So ATN universities plus Newcastle and Deakin strongly support putting the indexation arrangements enshrined into legislation.
Mr Chair, I'm just wondering, how is it that your Vice-Chancellors have agreed to certain things without the assurances in terms of legislation? They relied upon promises which aren't actually backed up with specific legislative measures.
Well, here we are, Senator. So we've put our submission in with the recommendations for improvements to this bill, particularly those provisions that enshrine funding indexation arrangements in legislation, which would improve the bill and give somewhat comfort to our universities. We did acknowledge the policy commitment of indexation arrangements in our media release when the Jobs Ready Graduates Package was announced on the 19th of June, and it's fundamentally important that those arrangements, particularly indexation, and which allows for growth over the medium
Yes.
and long
So-
term to be enshrined in legislation.
So, Mr. Sheehy, I recall a previous Prime Minister, a Liberal Prime Minister, promised there'd be no cuts to universities. How much is the funding being cut to your universities?
Well, I referred to some of your earlier questioning of Vice-Chancellor Bartlett, but we have had our own modelling undertaken based on data that's available to the universities, which of course is 2018 data.
Yes.
We understand that the department is using 2019 data, which is yet to be publicly available.
yes.
It usually is around in
Yes,
the next
yes.
couple of months.
Yes.
So overall, there are a number of component parts to the bill and the way it moves around with funding.
Yes.
But by the year 2024, our prediction across the 6 universities in our submission, the ATN +2, is overall there would be a reduction in 2024 of around $83 million.
Yes.
That doesn't take into account the transition fund, nor does it take into account the indexation arrangements applied to student contributions in 2019. So it would be very helpful if we had the 2019 data.
So you had the modelling.
Correct.
Yes. But the point is, it's an $83 million reduction to your specific universities, as you said. Now, can I take you to the other provisions of this bill? Let's just deal with that first. Student nurses, teachers, they have a reduction in terms of their contributions. That's clearly stated wherever we go. But the reduction in government support for a student nurse and teachers is between 18 and 24% for a 3-year degree. Would you agree?
Well, that is correct. Yes,
Yes,
there are
right.
reductions.
Now, how do you think that funding gap's going to be made up?
So there are a number of arrangements in the bill that the government's committed to, including a transition fund, and of course some of the savings directed from those teaching and learning grants are redirected to the NPILF, the National Priorities and Industry Linkages Fund, which again goes to improving teaching and learning innovation and better equipping our students for the workforce.
Yes, but there's no growth in the funding there. That's no new money. That's existing funding.
Correct. And I'd also refer to some remarks made by, I think, Margaret Gardner around the time of the Minister's announcement of this package. That this package deals with teaching and learning funding. So there is a lowering of the overall per student funding, both in terms of student contributions and the direct grants through this bill. That is true. And there is a separate process in order to look at how we then fund research, because as you know very well,
I'll
Senator...
come to the research in a minute. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
But I want to get to this HEP issue, because you see, the issue of what's currently the Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program is set by the basis of a formula where universities are allocated on the basis of their enrolments. That is, how many people they actually might be regarded as disadvantaged from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Under these arrangements, that no longer applies, does it?
The way we understand it is that the government is redirecting some of the growth in that to another fund.
So another fund, again, discretionary. It's not based on any rational formula, that is the number of people who actually enrol. It's based on a discretionary fund. Now, if it was done in any other branch of politics, it'd be, we might have some other names for that.
Well, let me put it this...
Sports grants, for instance, we'd call it something else, wouldn't we?
Let me answer it in this way. The demand-driven funding system implemented by the previous Labor government, which transformed higher education and delivered nearly 200,000 additional places, was enshrined in legislation, and that was a good thing. And consistently, the university sector asked for funding mechanisms to be enshrined in legislation. Yes. If it does change the Higher Education Support Act, we'd like to see those in legislation.
My point is this, Mr. Chair. If I read the arrangements that are being proposed here, and Mr Warburton picks this up again, he says there are no concrete proposal as to how the money in these new funds will ultimately be distributed. Right? There's an inference. We assure the arrangements will be simple and more transparent, and there'll be accountability for public funding. It's unclear, he says, how the assurances can be given.
Yes, and we would thank the Minister for consultation, but we'd also thank the government if they put all of these funds into the legislation.
So you had some real assurances. Now, I'm just wondering, what impact on quality will there be if you're increasing the level of student contributions, reducing the government contributions, the government amounts of money going from the government, increasing class sizes, are we? Are we actually reducing the level of service by universities to make up for that funding gap?
Well, I think that speaks to the fact that we've asked for a review of the funding rates, both in terms of student grant.
Is there a danger the quality will fall under this package?
We've asked for a review of it, and certainly we want to monitor how that impacts our operations and the objects of the bill.
Finally, the question of research. I did say that we'd come back to it. This package takes away the old model of funding dual system of the 30% of the base grant for research. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, could you state that again, Senator?
The Commonwealth Grants Scheme that's traditionally funded much of our research program, which is allocated on the basis of traditional models of 30-70, 30% towards research funding, 70% towards teaching, or it's research and scholarship to be more precise. That model is now taken away. Would you agree?
Well, I would agree that that model has changed, and I'd also refer to what Margaret Gardner said about it in terms of a consolidation for teaching and learning purposes. So yes, research funding has the cross-subsidy that we would have got normally from the Commonwealth Grant Scheme as it's currently legislated has changed. And there is separate processes ongoing with the sector and the Minister looking at that through the Research Sustainability Group, and of course,
Sure. That's
well
again on
that.
the never never. And I'm just wondering, given the new provisions that are outlined in the sister legislation, the Higher Education Provider Category Standards and Other Measures Bill, the new regulations setting down minimum categories for research attainment in universities. Are you familiar with those?
I am. It was written by Peter Koltrak, who's probably a father of the ATN.
Yes, that's right. So, of course, the ATN will have no trouble meeting those criteria, will they?
We're not concerned about meeting those requirements.
But the University of Sydney, on the other hand, says that some universities should be.
We don't make a habit, really, Senator, of making comments on other universities in our submissions.
Of course you don't. But the Sydney University has made the observation that some universities won't be able to meet that criteria.
That may very well be the case, but I don't spend a lot of time making myself familiar with other universities. I'm busy with my own forecast.
Yes, that's good. I'm just wondering what the consequences would be if a university loses the capacity to call itself a university because it doesn't meet the fundamental criteria in terms of research.
Well, I assume that if, in a hypothetical world, that university would have to then consider what it's called, and I assume it would become a university college under the current proposals.
Well, that's gone as well. That's gone as well under these provisions. I'm just wondering, you would have thought about this, surely, the consequences of this. If the funding base for the Commonwealth is being reduced, the level of student pricing is gone up, and the capacity of universities to meet these basic requirements on research is actually declining. What the consequences would be, particularly for universities that don't have a strong research record. Now, you've indicated that that wouldn't include your universities. What is, nonetheless, would you know, as an expert in higher education, what is the consequence of a university currently called loses that capacity because it can't meet its basic research criteria, which of course defines a university at the moment?
Well, I think it comes to university missions, and as long as the university or the Institute of Higher Education or whatever it might be can fulfil that mission to its part of the country and ensure that it produces good graduates and world-class research, that's a good thing. But Senator, I'd add this, that the university sector... Yes, Senator.
Isn't it the case that regional university students are already somewhat compromised in their access to a university qualification? And isn't it also the case that many of the research universities are located in major cities, that it would follow then that regional students who would be subject to the wave of disadvantage that Senator Carr's just been outlining would mean regional students would be subject to increases in cost? but decreases in the quality of the degree because the university wouldn't be wouldn't be called a university anymore. Isn't that the likely longer-term outcome of what Senator Carr's been describing?
Well, we're not talking about the provider category standards legislation today, but what I would say
they're all
But they're
related.
interconnected, aren't they, Mr. Sheehy?
Well, of course they are. The general reforms from the government are interrelated, but we've always had concerns as a university grouping about access and equity and participation in higher education in Australia. So any impediments to that is problematic for our grouping, and particularly for regional students. We know that regional attainment educational attainment in regional Australia is lower than metropolitan Australia. We know it's lower in different states and different parts of the country. Outer suburban, regional students in remote areas do generally have less access or less attainment in higher education. We always have supported policies that help promote that. If there is an existential threat to that being delivered, of course we would oppose it strongly. But where there are policy settings that promote that equity and participation, we would support it, and which we do.
Senator Pratt, I think that's a question.
Senator, sorry, I'm just looking at the time. I was hoping to throw to Senator Faruqi now to ask some questions, if that's possible, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Senator
Thanks,
Pratt,
Mr.
I believe,
Sheehy.
had some questions, Chair.
I realise that Labor, you've had
Yes, I do.
worth of questions. I'm hoping to throw to Senator Faruqi, unless Senator Pratt, you've got one or two questions as Deputy Chair. I'm happy doing that, but I am mindful of the time, and the Labor's already had it. I'm keen for the Greens to have a go.
In
Thank you.
conclusion, Mr. Sheehy, it supports an amended bill, and it states that ATN always strongly supports policy positions which aim to grow and strengthen Australia's higher education system and particularly measures that increase access and equity. You know as well as I do that this package more than doubles the gap between the highest and lowest pays in the system, actually increasing it to fourfold. It cuts, CSD funding, and it hikes student fees in many areas. So how exactly does this bill increase equity in any way, shape or form?
Thank you, Senator. So there is a commitment from the government in this package for additional places over the medium and long term. There is changes and improvements to the way that we fund targeted access and equity measures. There is particularly of interest to the ATN +2 universities is the guarantee of an undergraduate place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Of course, we'd like that guarantee to go to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, not just those in remote and regional Australia. And it's a long-standing commitment of the university sector, and ATN is no different, to have a guaranteed undergraduate place for all Australians. But as the bill is currently written, we looked at it in a number of ways. Firstly, it will improve the current system that is in place. It will ensure that 50% of university costs are borne by the Commonwealth. It guarantees access to a higher education loan program, which of course is the most progressive and well-designed income contingent loan system in the world. And we have also then, to strengthen that, called for a review of the teaching and learning rates over the next 12 months to ensure that their students aren't disadvantaged and universities aren't disadvantaged. It speaks to both educational opportunity but also quality and excellence. So we want to make sure that none of those things are jeopardised through that bill, and that's why in our recommendation we've asked for a review of those fields.
It is quite clear that students will be disadvantaged with these massive fee hikes and decades and huge burdens of debt. Just going back to your support for expanding demand-driven access to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which I completely agree with. The Innovative Research Universities has found that average Indigenous student contribution under the will actually increase by 15% to $9,550. So does this increase access or equity, you think? And will this help close the gap?
I think if we look at the fundamental principle, if there's access to a place, and we know through Closing the Gap reports that have been tabled by the government that educational attainment, particularly at higher education, is one of the best and most effective ways to close the gap. So our first principle in this is to make sure that we can guarantee a place for every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. It is problematic when there are fees put in the system, but we've looked at the bill in its entirety and looked at those provisions, including the majority funding from the Commonwealth, the access to the help scheme, additional arrangements for access and equity and participation under the new funds, and of course, if they were enshrined in legislation, Senator Carr, that would be good as well. And that would overall is a package that moves from the current arrangements in a more equity and participation way. Sorry, Senator, for interrupting.
That's all right. I just said Senator Faruqi speaking to you, not Senator Carr. Just going back, Commonwealth support places. Government has promised an increase of 39,000 places by 2023 across 40-odd universities. Will this increase satisfy the burgeoning demand for higher education at your universities? Because what's becoming clear is that it will be just a drop in the ocean from what universities are telling us.
Yeah, we certainly have recognised the fact that during a global pandemic, there will be a counter-cyclical demand in particularly higher education, but in post-secondary education across the board. And we have already seen anecdotally significant increases in demand. I don't have particulars for all of my 6 universities, but I'm happy to take that increase in demand on notice for you. And we will see what that looks like, whether or not the additional places that the government's committed to as part of their policy parameters in this bill actually A, sufficient, and B, can deliver what we need in the medium to long term. We also understand, of course, that there is a baby boom coming, the so-called Costello baby boom, and that needs to be factored in, and I know the government's put some consideration around that. But it's important for a continual review of this. That's why we've asked for a review of the funding rates, because that speaks to how we can continue to deliver excellence in higher education for Australians.
Mr. Sheehy, with all the amendments that you have suggested, with all the flaws that have been highlighted throughout the process since this legislation was announced, with the uncertainties, with the lack of evidence that the legislation is based on, don't you think the government should go back to the drawing board and find some other way of funding arrangement for increasing CSPs and supporting regional universities? Perhaps even the radical idea of actually increasing much needed funding. Would that be an option you would be willing to support?
I don't think any university would oppose additional funding in the higher education and research system in Australia. I think that's a given. But I think in particular, our amendments are 6 and they are sensible. And I think if they were made and considered and moved by the government or the crossbench or the opposition for that matter, it would be improve the bill. And as I said in the submission, it would prove the objects of the bill and make it a fair and equitable one. I'd also highlight the fact that the current arrangements are no longer going to be fit for purpose over the long term. So this bill enshrines a range of measures, particularly, again, if they were put into legislation, that could, in the long term, give us more certainty and stability in the sector.
Just last,
Senator
last question from me, Senator.
Okay. Yes.
I just want to go to the issue of grandfathering. Do you think it's fair for students in year 11, 12, and those on gap year in 2020 to go into this change system? Because, they've already made their decisions about courses they selected.
I think...
Do you not be grandfathered from these changes?
Yeah, I've worked very closely with others in the sector, particularly the innovative research universities, on school leavers. No one would have predicted that Year 12 and Year 11 students would be going through the difficulties they have with remote learning, and it's a tribute to educators across the country for the great job that they're doing. We would like to see, of course, measures put in place to assist those students in whatever way we can. If it means the government considered, extending the grandfathering arrangements for those, so be it. There is, I would note, reductions in student contributions in some places, in many places in this bill. So we'd have to have a more considered effort than just a universal adoption of grandfathering. I think there needs to be a bit more nuanced policy, but certainly we should help those students who are very, very much being disrupted in 2020.
Thank you for that. We'll go to Senator Patrick. And just so people are aware, Senator Patrick, you have about 5 minutes. We are due to have a short suspension at 10:40 Eastern Standard Time. What we'll do is, after Senator Patrick is finished, we will break for 5 minutes to enable people to do what they need to do for 5 minutes, and then recommence after those 5 minutes. Senator Patrick, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to ask very quickly 3 questions about funding. Across your 4 member universities, over the next 3 years, are you expecting an increase in government funding over those next 3 years for each of the 3 years?
Thank you, Senator Patrick. Our modelling, as I said earlier, is based on our available data, which is 2018 data, which doesn't factor in the indexation in student contribution and the 2019 funding arrangement. So we've done our best to model that. As I said, as we get to 2024, our prediction is that we'll be across our 4 plus our 2 observer members, $83 million down, but that doesn't also take into consideration the transition fund. So there is a relative amount of cost neutrality in this bill, but we don't have the relative data to be able to make that full assessment. I'm happy to take on notice some of our modelling, and I'd have to, of course, seek permission from my universities to do that, but we can provide what we have to you.
Thank you very much. What about funding per student over the next 3 years? Does it increase? Government funding per student, does it increase or does it decrease?
Fundamentally, it changes a whole range of arrangements. So we've gone from 8 funding direct subsidy rates and 3 contribution rates to 4 and 4. That makes substantial changes across the board to per student funding. And when I say per student funding, I mean the direct subsidy that's given as a subsidised student and the student contribution. So it moves around, and I'll happily take more detail about the impact on our individual universities on notice, as well as the impact on overall student contributions from our universities.
So, and can you just clarify, in answering those questions, you're talking the bill as it stands or the bill as you think it would be amended?
Yes, we haven't recommended recommendations to those funding rates. I know some of my colleagues in the sector have, but as the bill is drafted, we have made we've done our modelling.
Okay, and what about the personal cost to your students or your projected students over the next 3 years? Does that increase or decrease? So this is their contribution as opposed to the government's.
So there are a number of moving parts with this that impact how we make that assessment. Firstly, the bill now unshackles the assessment of fees. It moves it towards per student calculations. So if a student did take something from a lower cost subject, it would impact their student contributions. We have some detailed modelling at just a couple of our universities. Bearing in mind we have a significant enrolment in as the Australian Technology Network of students in engineering, science and maths. So we have lower student contributions in that space, but lower subsidy rates. So it is a complicated beast, but as I said earlier, I'm happy to take on notice what the overall impact is to our students based on our modelling.
All right, that would be greatly appreciated. My final question is goes to the objective of the bill, which is to encourage higher education providers to provide job-ready graduates. I mean, there's the previous witness, and it's my belief, and I'm trying to find a contradictor, that funding is rather abstract to students and has very little meaning in respect of choices that students make about their courses. Do you have a view on that at all?
So I think there's been some discussion already around incentives based on student contributions and whether or not they work. We've asked the government to have a look at that as part of our recommendation on a review. Secondly, in terms of job-ready graduates, I think it's worth noting that some of the savings made from the reduction in particularly science and maths subsidies are then quarantined and redirected to the National Priorities in Industry Linkages Fund, of which our chair of the ATN, Attila Brunks, is chairing a review of that fund on behalf of the Minister and the Government. That will help assist universities with their compact-based missions to look at things like work-integrated learning and how they engage with industry throughout their course of their university, particularly undergraduate degree. So there's a significant amount of policy work in the NPILF that helps with the job-ready graduates component of this bill. So that's the first part. In terms of incentive for students to take certain disciplines based on student contribution rates, this has worked in the past. We saw with the Rudd government's removal of student contributions for science and maths courses in 2008 that there was an increase in student numbers in that discipline. However, when the subsidy was removed, the student enrolment rate stayed the same or in fact increased. So I think it's a combination of signalling from both political will and, as well as a financial incentive. It's always difficult to understand those incentives when we have an income contingent loan and that students don't have to pay anything upfront. So it always is a slightly more nuanced assessment of what the impact might be.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Patrick. So thank you for coming along here today. The committee will now take a brief suspension until 10:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, whatever it is. So colleagues, please stay online, but mute and whatever, and we'll recommence at 10:50 with the group of 8. So thank you very much.